Hey guys, this is Robert Breedlove from the What is Money Show. And as you've learned by watching this show, Bitcoin is the single most important asset you can own in the 21st century. And one of the most important companies in Bitcoin today is NYDIG. NYDIG's mission is to facilitate financial security for all. They accomplish this by bringing a high level of professionalization and sophistication to the Bitcoin marketplace. As a true game changer in the industry, NYDIG is safely unlocking the power of Bitcoin for forward-thinking individuals and institutions alike. By using NYDIG, you will gain access to an end-to-end institutional-grade platform, providing Bitcoin OTC transactions, Bitcoin collateralized borrowing, secure custody, asset management, derivatives, financing, market research, and more. And all of these services meet the highest regulatory, governance, and audit standards. Led by Robbie Gutman, Yin Zhao, and Ross Stevens, NYDIG has absolutely exploded onto the Bitcoin scene recently and is leading the way for ongoing institutional adoption in this nascent asset class. So please be sure to check out NYDIG as a single source for all your Bitcoin needs. All right, guys, welcome back to the What is Money Show. I am sitting down today with author Geoffrey Miller, who's done a lot of interesting work in the domains of evolutionary psychology, which pertains to a lot of other areas we're going to talk about today, like Darwinism and game theory and things that really impact human behavior in a deep way. So, Geoffrey, welcome to the show.
Robert, great to be here. Yeah, so I'm an evolutionary psychologist, and that means I try to figure out how human nature works, including our emotions and preferences and desires and values. And we try to do that by leveraging our understanding of prehistory, using evidence from genetics and fossils, archaeology, anthropology, primate behavior, and we kind of weave that all together. I've been working in this field for about 30 years, and I've most recently worked for about 20 years at the University of New Mexico here in beautiful, sunny Albuquerque. And, a lot of my work is focused on mate choice and sexual selection, but I've also got diverse other interests that we'll probably end up touching on. Plus a newfound passion for crypto as of basically January this year. So I'm a super enthusiastic newbie in that domain.
Class of 2021.
Exactly.
That's excellent. Well, I'm sure we'll get into it, but there's this, as I mentioned to you offline, there's a very key component, perhaps the key component to understanding Bitcoin is glimpsing the game theoretic aspects of it. And those are rooted clearly in human behavior, but even more deeply than that in Darwinism, right? In Darwinian evolutionary theory, I guess you may even say. So maybe we could start there. Can you I know you said you worked on this for a long time in your career. Like, how did you get started into Darwinism? How would you introduce it to someone? Maybe someone's a class of 2021 to Darwinism. So maybe we could explain it to them from kind of first principles.
Kind of emotional heart of Darwinism to me is just the realization that every single one of our ancestors, going back hundreds of millions of years, managed to survive and reproduce. And we are the outcomes of sort of an unbroken series of evolutionary success stories. And if we weren't, we wouldn't be here. Some other creatures would be here instead of us. And, Darwin's great insight was realizing the full implications of that, really thinking hard about what does it mean to be descended from many, many, many generations of organisms that didn't just survive, but also found mates, reproduced, raised offspring if they're doing parental investment. Many of them lived in groups and had to deal with the challenges of group living, which touches very much on the game theory aspects that you mentioned. So I got into this originally when I was a naive young grad student in psychology at Stanford back in the late 80s. And I'd planned to study cognitive psychology, learning, memory, categorization, et cetera. But there were a couple of postdocs who happened to come to my advisor's lab. My advisor was Roger Shepard, leading cognitive psychologist. These postdocs were Lita Cosmides and John Tooby, a couple who basically founded evolutionary psychology. And they were basically inventing it right under my nose at Stanford in the late 80s, trying to figure out how do you kind of combine an understanding of evolutionary theory from biology with an understanding of kind of cognitive and emotional psychology in terms of thinking about how did our minds specifically get shaped by evolution. They also brought into it, interestingly, a kind of Austrian economics libertarian political philosophy. So Lita Cosmides' dissertation back at Harvard had been to study the psychology of trade, the psychology of reciprocity, and how we kind of strike bargains with each other economically in prehistory, way before money. And how do you develop systems of trust and accountability and kind of governance? How do you detect cheaters? How do you build up a good reputation for being trustable trade partner? And that literally is at the foundation of evolutionary psychology. You know, my field's kind of stereotyped as being all about mating. But in terms of its intellectual history, it really has deep roots in Austrian economics, the theory of reciprocal altruism in trade, in kind of evolutionary game theory, and in these fundamental social questions of how do you get, you know, positive sum gains from trade, even in a little small scale tribal society before money.
Interesting. Yeah, that's I like that framing. It's kind of a positive, optimistic framing too. That, you know, we're all winners. You know, all of our ancestors were successful at reproduction, and they're, you know, that would be a super slim minority, I would imagine, relative to all the animals that ever existed. So it's kind of like, I love, I think Richard Dawkins has this analogy. He talks about the digital river, like the genetic information flowing forward in time, and that each organism is like a filter for that genetic information, determining which genes are fit for reality or reproduction and which are unfit. So I think that's just an interesting way to look at it. And I to your point about the relationship between evolution and economics, they're very similar in my mind because they're both driven by exchange and discernment, right? We're selecting who to exchange and what to exchange with who, and who to relate with, who to form groups with. And they kind of reinforce one another too. So through, you know, there's this economic aspect even to evolution, where the organism's trying to develop certain features that let it accomplish more with less. Which is, I say this sometimes, and this may be kind of a rough analogy, but evolution is biological innovation, and innovation is inorganic evolution, something like that. Like they're very, very similar patterns. How then would you? Maybe I'll just kind of give my rough understanding of general Darwinism, and then you can give me some feedback or correction on it. Is Darwinism in this sense where life is just experimenting through variation, and then I guess you'd say natural selection, nature is kind of that which selects? I know it doesn't necessarily have a conscious mind. It's a bit, I forget the term you use, where it's not like a deity selecting necessarily. It's more like the fitness of the environment favoring some genetics and disfavoring others. So there's this expansion through variation, but then this culling of those mutations through fitness selection. Is that roughly correct?
Sure. Yeah. It's basically what's called blind variation and selective retention is one mechanism. And a lot of people in psychology have made, I think, really good analogies between, evolutionary biological selection in nature and the mechanisms of creativity within the human mind, where we also come up with kind of random variations or semi-random, like if I'm playing chess, possible moves you could try, and then you test them out in a kind of mental simulation against what's the opponent going to do? What are the possible counter moves? What are my counter moves? Blah, blah, blah. So I think there are deep analogies between this kind of evolutionary selection in nature, the genetic level, psychological selection in humans, the way that, products get invented in the marketplace and nobody's really sure who's going to buy them,
Right.
how consumers will react, or also crucially how investors will react, or how regulators will react. And so all of these selective ecosystems have some deep similarities. And I kind of come at this from 3 different kind of phases in my career. In grad school, it was all about the kind of evolutionary biology, trying to understand that, animal behavior, primate behavior. But then I did a postdoc at University of Sussex where we did a lot of computational simulations, genetic algorithms and neural networks and evolutionary robotics. And that was trying to apply the same evolutionary principles to the design of kind of artificial cognitive systems, or AI, or machine learning systems. So I think there's also a deep similarity between evolutionary dynamics in nature and the way that a lot of machine learning, like reinforcement learning, works. And then in the late 90s, I worked in an evolutionary game theory center at University College London that was housed in the economics department. And I tried to kind of get up to speed with how economists think about applying game theory to human interaction. And so I think there's a computational side to this, there's an evolutionary biology side, and then there's kind of an economic side. And I try to weave all those kind of themes together, whether I'm trying to understand human mating in mating markets, or trying to understand, let's say, virtue signaling at the political level, or even trying to understand the crypto industry.
Interesting. Yeah. Crypto definitely touches a lot of those domains as well. So I'm not sure I'm going to have the right terminology here, but so I guess in the course of Darwinian evolution, there's a factor of nature selecting, or the environment determining what features or genes are exhibit fitness for reproduction, I guess you would say. It's like a competent survival strategy given the conditions. But there's also this choice, this conscious element, right, where you talk about mate selection. How do you distinguish between the two, and how do they reinforce one another? I think it's very interesting in that we participate in our own evolution to some extent, I guess you could say.
Yeah, so there's kind of different levels of evolutionary selection. Sometimes you have the actual objective habitat, like weather, selecting organisms to be able to fit into some eco niche, some habitat. Like if it's too cold, you evolve thicker fur, you evolve better thermoregulation abilities, you have different foraging strategies to find enough food to build up enough fat to survive the winter. Okay, so that's objective selection by the environment. A little more game theoretic is a situation where maybe you're a vulnerable animal and you're facing predators. And the predators, if you're a social animal, like in a herd, the predators aren't going to randomly chase like the nearest animal. They're going to make a predator choice. Who do I target?
Yeah.
Who looks the oldest or the youngest or the sickest or the slowest? And they're going to go after that. So the predator choice in that kind of context can actually favor prey animals, kind of showing off. I'm energetic. I can leap high. I can run fast. I can dodge well. And then you get prey kind of signaling, don't mess with me. I'm not worth chasing. Chase that other guy.
Right.
You just have to be faster than your rival. You don't have to be faster than the predator. And then in the domain of sexuality, if you've got a two sex species with sexual reproduction, males and females, and then you get scope for each sex selecting the other in terms of mating. Who do I want to mate with? Whose genes do I want to combine my genes with? And then you get potential for the evolution of all kinds of extravagant signals called sexual ornaments, like the peacock's tail, or courtship behaviors like, the nightingale song or human conversation. And once you get to that kind of sexual selection domain, then the sort of signaling issues get fascinating and very complicated, and they can drive amazing diversity of signals across species, but also amazing complexity of signals within a species, because there's basically no upper bound to how good you can appear as a mate, other than like what you can afford in terms of energy and time and risk.
That's really interesting. So there's this, I think in your book, you describe it as there's a survival cost to these displays, but there's a reproductive benefit, right? It's not obvious that why would the peacock expend all this energy in these large, showy tail feathers, but it's because it's increasing his chances for reproduction. So I've been talking to John Vervaeke recently. Do you know who that is?
Sort of vaguely, yeah.
Yeah, he's a University of Toronto psychologist, and he has this YouTube lecture series. But one thing that just popped into mind as you were saying that is he describes our capacity for adaptation is premised on the same, I guess it's genetic and biological machinery that can lead us to self-deception as well. And I think some of your work tied into this. We're saying humans developed the ability to be an ideological animal as part of this, right? Like it was a reproductive fitness feature, but it also has opened us up to be, it's not necessarily intended to map to truth. It's intended to map for attention grabbing. I think that's roughly right.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So the crazy thing about signaling, and it really took me like a decade to wrap my head around this fully. The crazy thing about signaling is there is a lot of truth being conveyed, but it's typically not truth about the content of the signal. It's usually truth about the quality of the signaler. Okay. So there's a big difference. For example, if you look at luxury goods being advertised through expensive commercials, what an expensive like commercial for a luxury car or watch or fashion, will include is typically a whole bunch of like either false or unfalsifiable, just kind of associations. Like, here's an aspirational lifestyle, and if you buy our stuff, then you will enter into this like rarefied zone of success and amazing mates and an amazing lifestyle. And if you ask, is that even a truth claim? Not really, but the cost of the ad is the point. If a company like, Tesla or Rolex or Fendi or Prada can afford really good models, really good directors, really high production values, great lighting, great locations, that kind of testifies to the quality and longevity and reputability of the company. And so that's advertising, right? Yeah. And the peacock's tail is similar. Like the peacock's tail is just iridescent blue and green, radially symmetric eye spots that are large. They're not really conveying information. Like the peacock's tail is not making like a philosophical argument in a right. text form. Yes. It's simply saying, I'm the kind of peacock that can afford a big, bright, colorful tail. If I was sick or starving or had too many mutations, I would not be able to afford this tail.
Right.
So it's kind of a truth claim about the peacock's genes and its body and its energy level.
Now, this is interesting because I think we can tie this into Bitcoin, actually. And tell me if I'm stretching the analogy too far, but it's almost like a form of biological proof of work, right? Exactly. It's saying that, I, as an organism, have obtained enough resources to satisfy my basic needs that I can afford the luxury of these showy peacock feathers. And from that same excess reservoir of, I guess, energy, for lack of a better term, I could support a large and healthy family and, guard a territory and all of these things. Is that approximately correct?
Yeah, totally. One of my favorite biologists is a guy, Israeli biologist, Amos Zahavi. And Zahavi wrote this amazing book in, I think, 97 called The Handicap Principle, all about these kind of costly signaling principles. Why does the peacock's tail have to be so big and cumbersome? And Zahavi had a lot of analogies to modern human culture, including to advertising and to kind of ridiculous fashions and like, why do rich business people, at least back then in the 90s, wear bespoke, expensive Italian suits that are hand tailored? If Zahavi was writing that book today, I'm sure he would have mentioned proof of work as a great example of costly signaling. I don't know quite what his take would have been on proof of stake or proof of history or other ways that crypto tries to be credible, but certainly I think there's a deep link between costly signaling theory and certain ways that you kind of validate blocks in blockchain in a way that is credible to everyone. And I think your series with Michael Saylor sort of dovetails very much with this point.
Yeah, I think so. And there's such an interesting connection there again between the economic and biological domain, because if we look at gold through that lens, clearly gold was valued based on the proof of work necessary to obtain it, right? It takes a lot of energy and time to go out and find this rare metal. But then we would also use that as a mechanism of display. We would ornament ourselves with gold, and that would become a tool to attract mates or get attention, I guess. Or it's a form of conspicuous consumption, isn't it? That's the same thing as the suits and sports cars and all these other things, right?
Yeah, absolutely. There's such deep, wonderful analogies, also between Zahavi's handicap principle and Thorsten Veblen's theory of the leisure class, where he talks about conspicuous consumption.
The Veblen good, right?
Yeah, the Veblen good. So basically, Veblen in the 1890s almost single-handedly invented costly signaling theory, and then like 80 years later, biologists kind of rediscover it and apply it to sexual selection and animal behavior, and then we psychologists kind of rediscovered that.
Yeah.
Another example, though, that's worth mentioning is Michael Spence, the economist in the 70s, talking about conspicuous credentials and why do people pay for elite college degrees, right? And that's another kind of proof of trait that you have the intelligence and conscientiousness and money to afford the degree. And the Harvard degree or Stanford degree, it doesn't necessarily carry information about what you learned when you were there.
Yeah.
But it carries a lot of information about your kind of like heritable intelligence and your hard work and maybe your family finances, et cetera. So I think there's like a wonderful kind of Venn diagram of like economics, biology, marketing, crypto, proof of work that still needs to be more fully explored, I think, because it still has a lot of big economic and social implications today.
Yes, agreed. So I have a bit of and this is not my theory, but it's a theory I've gathered from just some reading and research that I'll try to air it out here. First thing, I'd like to say something about the Veblen good you just brought up. So the definition of a Veblen good, as I understand it, is actually a good whose demand increases as its price increases, which is opposite from most other goods. So it's something that the more desired it is, the more desirous it becomes in a way. And I think we can define, or we could at least look at money is kind of one of the ultimate Veblen goods. If we're talking about gold or something like Bitcoin, because actually the more expensive Bitcoin becomes, the less risk it has associated with it, and the more likely it is to consume all other monies. The fitness it has displayed, I guess, as the ultimate monetary technology. So I think that I just wanted to tie that in and define Veblen goods for the audience. But this connection between the biological and economic domain, I read this book called The Territorial Imperative. It's kind of an older book, but there's this biological impulse among most forms of life to be territorial, so to gain and keep territory, mostly for the purposes of reproduction. And my theory and the author's theory in the book and others is that actually human beings clearly were territorial. I don't think that's contested, but we express our territoriality through property rights, right? So and property we just consider as like the most basic form of property is yourself. You own your own time. You are self-owned. And then a secondary form of property is you can go out and take your time, energy, skills, talents, and combine it with different portions of nature to, plant a farm or build a house or make a wagon, whatever it is. And then you own that property. And the theory of capitalism, at least, is that you should now be able to trade that property with other self-owned people. And that's how we create wealth and the division of labor and so on. And that to me would also explain, so property rights then are how we've, I guess, abstracted this very innate biological impulse called the territorial imperative. It also explains to me how people, money then would be the ultimate property effectively, because it lays claim to every other property. You can take money as the most tradable asset and acquire anything else. It explains why people have why money has such a deep psychological significance to people, because it's getting to this very base level reptilian brain, I'm guessing, mind state. Have you thought about that much, property rights and territoriality?
Yeah, absolutely. So Robert Ardrey, I think back in the 60s, did that territorial imperative book. And, some of it was maybe a little simplistic, but I do think there's a deep sense of ownership that not just humans, but I think many animals have. And the reason is it kind of goes back to the Richard Dawkins concept of the extended phenotype, right? The phenotype is your kind of animal body and your brain itself, but your extended phenotype would include like your clothing and a nest that you make and a territory that you hold. And, if you're a spider, your web is your extended phenotype. If you're a beaver and you build a dam and you create a lake, that makes it easier to catch food, the lake is your extended phenotype.
Oh, okay.
And so I think human people as social primates certainly have this sense of like, this is my tribe, this is our territory, and we have a special claim to it. And where you get upset if someone infringes on your territory, just the way a spider in its tiny little spider brain would probably get kind of upset if you messed with its web.
Right.
It invested time and energy in making, or if some, invading, beaver couple took over your beaver dam. So I do not agree with the kind of Marxist Leninist idea that property is sort of a recent cultural invention. I think it runs really, really deep in animal behavior.
Yes.
And when, like one of my mentors at University of Sussex was John Maynard Smith, the evolutionary game theorist. And he did a bunch of papers showing that even for simple animals, if you kind of run the game theoretic modeling about what happens if there's a conflict between like an animal that has a territory and an invading animal that wants the territory, you often get a situation where sort of property is 9/10 of the law. Like if the animals assume that the animal that's already there kind of has a stronger claim to the territory than the new animal, that actually helps you avoid a lot of pointless conflict,
right,
and injury and death that would otherwise result. So I would not I don't know to what extent animal psychologists have looked into do chimps or beavers or other animals have a kind of intuitive sense of property rights. But I would be really surprised if they didn't. And I think you're right that money is sort of the an abstraction of that.
Mm-hmm.
And I just think of money as liquid fitness.
Mm.
Right? Money is something that you can trade for any other form of fitness that might be useful to you, whether it's food or territories or mates or childcare or protection or, a better social network or whatever.
Well, I have to thank you because this is called the What is Money Show, and I'm actually always looking for more answers. I have a list of probably 50 answers to that question. I'm writing a little bit about each of them. Liquid fitness is a new one for me. So thank you for that. That's awesome. Can we dive into, well, let's actually further to your point. So then property, our mode of civilization, it's premised on property. Effectively, it has to be, to your point, the law, possession is 9/10 of the law. So there seems to be that there's this organizing principle then around the economics of property. We could maybe say the defensibility of property, right? The more defensible it is, the cost, what would we say? The higher the cost to benefit ratio of attacking someone else's property, the more civilized we would become because there's less incentive to transgress against others' property. And gold was a big innovation, actually, in that respect, because gold gave us a way to store a lot of economic value in a relatively small space that we could defend and secure. But it represented a claim on a lot of manpower, a lot of labor, right? A very small amount of gold represented a claim on a lot of economic effort. And have you heard of this book, The Sovereign Individual?
I've heard of it, but I haven't read it yet. It's on my list.
Yeah. So it's written in 1997 and it predicted a number of things. One of which was Bitcoin. They called anonymous cyber cash, I think. And they made the point that it would so radically alter this cost benefit on money, again, or on property, that it would radically reduce the incentives to violence. And also would cause the separation of money and state, which would cause the government to shrink. So it's almost like this is probably related to Darwinism again, the economic realities that we face, which are largely based on the technological realities we inhabit, they percolate up through our political systems and determine how we organize ourselves.
Yeah, totally. So, the one kind of grain of truth in the traditional Marxist account is that you have your kind of economic base, which is how you actually defend property and make investments and trade labor. And then you got like the superstructure, which is all the sort of self-deceptive stories and narratives that we spin around, why things are arranged that way and what legitimizes that system and so forth. But people haven't fully taken that on board, and they haven't fully taken on board what a profound challenge to both the economic base and that kind of ideological superstructure, something like Bitcoin or crypto in general really is. Because, just the way that shifting from kind of barter, where like you have to have exactly something I want and I have to have something you want in order for us to strike a bargain. Shifting from that to a money system where there's, medium of exchange, it's more abstract. And, shifting from that to like fiat currency, which is like marginally easier to trade, but is subject to all kinds of, debauchery and ruin. And then shifting to crypto, these kind of developments are so profound that it's extremely hard to predict their full implications.
Yes.
Up front.
Yes. And the other thing that really interests me about Bitcoin is that all the property rights we've had historically, anything that's not a bearer asset, let's say, right? Like the gold you can hold and defend, or the diamonds or whatever, even anything, I guess even the land, if it's defensible. Again, it all comes back down to defensibility. Other property rights were dependent then on that ideological superstructure, as you describe it, right? This monopoly on violence or the legal system, like the shadow of force in the shadow of force, all peaceful property transactions were conducted. But Bitcoin is something fundamentally different in that we now have a property right, a bearer asset that's pure information. So it's literally the easiest, I mean, I'm not going to say easiest asset to custody, but the lowest cost asset to custody per unit of economic value, right? You could store $1 billion of Bitcoin in your brain, the cost being memorizing your seed phrase. And it's a property independent of that monopoly on violence or ideological superstructure. So it largely, if it really succeeds, it renders that largely irrelevant. So I'm like, I mean, it's difficult to imagine the implications.
Yeah, I think, a sort of underappreciated aspect of gold is that it's not just portable, it's actually very easy to hide, and it's very, very portable by individuals fleeing warfare and oppression.
That's right.
Often you'll sort of dig up Bronze Age, sites where people have kind of buried gold, maybe in hopes of unearthing it later. And if you're the invader and everybody's just buried their store of value and you have no idea where it is, it's stored in their head, the location of it. Mm-hmm. It's a little bit Bitcoiny in that sense. Whereas if all your wealth is in the form of land that could be taken, or farmhouses and outbuildings, or herd animals like sheep or cattle, those are actually much easier to see and steal. So they're much less defensible than some highly concentrated form of wealth like gold or Bitcoin.
Yes.
But of course, in an ideal world, you'd want, here's where I'm going to become the Cardano shill a little bit. You'd also ideally want some kind of secure decentralized crypto platform that could also secure property rights to other things like real estate ownership, or whose car is this, or do you have a kind of secure economic identity that can persist even in the face of like a civil war or disturbances or regime change. So ideally you wouldn't be forced to put like 90% of your net worth just in the form of one crypto store of value. You might also kind of like to have other property rights and claims that were also cryptographically secure, against regime change or against warfare. And where, like, if you had, like, here's my house in Albuquerque or whatever, I'm actually house sitting, so this isn't my house, but hypothetically, if this was my house and then like whoever invaded and took it over, but then peace was restored, I would like to be able to prove that, well, this was my house, like ex ante before the disruption, and therefore I still have a claim to it, rather than just having access to Bitcoin and nothing else.
Yeah, so you're talking about the digitization of other property rights beyond just money. This is something I think about a lot as well. I don't have the answers, but I would encourage you to check out, I hope I get the acronym correct, RGB, which is a higher layer protocol built on Bitcoin that enables probably a lot of the things, and I don't know much about Cardano, probably a lot of the things Cardano claims to do can be done by RGB on Bitcoin. So the key part, so you were describing the ability to flee and then return and claim the property that's there. The key component there is decentralization. So it's the database that cannot be corrupted or manipulated. And this is a property that, in my opinion, all other crypto assets lack at this point. I think Bitcoin is the only truly decentralized crypto asset in the world. May that change? Possibly, but as of today, I tend to think we're going to have almost a full consolidation at the base layer in the Bitcoin, with other features being built on higher layers. And that's just kind of my current read on the market there.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you to clarify a couple of terms here. So you mentioned phenotype earlier, which would be not only your biological features, but also the extended features of your environment. If you're, the beaver's dam or the spider's web. How is that related to genotype? Is genotype the actual informational pattern that expresses the phenotype?
Yeah, so your genotype is the information in your DNA. It's your genetic recipe for building a phenotype, right? And, there's a lot of intermediate steps. There's like your genome, which is the genetic information of your genotype. There's your proteome, which is the set of all the proteins in your body or a particular cell. And, your epigenome, which is how your DNA has been modified by methylation and whatever other chemical processes. And then your phenotype is like your body, your brain, your behavior, whatever your genotype uses basically to make more copies of the genes in your body. So from an evolutionary viewpoint, your phenotype is just, a gene's way of making more copies of itself.
Gotcha. So then territoriality or property then is kind of part of that extended phenotype.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay.
And so to all intents and purposes, modern people in a complex market economy have some of the most important parts of their phenotype or their extended phenotype are, their educational credentials, their social media presence, what's in their bank account, their legally enforceable property rights, the social reputation, their, anything that could be socially recognized as a type of value by others, and anything where if someone else messed with it or undermined it or injured it, you would suffer a real and concrete kind of handicapping of your ability to function in the world, including to survive and reproduce.
So then political systems today, so the revenue to say the US government or another political system is taxation and inflation. Both of these are non-consensual exchanges of value. So they're confiscating value from market actors effectively. So the way I'm viewing this through the biological lens is they're almost hijacking the extended phenotypes of people, right? So it becomes a lever for their own fitness.
Yeah, government is a parasite that sucks up your extended phenotype, and sucks away your liquid fitness, which is your money, right? One way or another, as you say, through taxes or inflation.
Wow.
Or another way of handicapping your fitness or undermining your extended phenotype would be any form of government regulation.
Yes.
That keeps you from being able to do the kind of economically valuable or socially or reproductively valuable exchanges that you might want to do. So, so a nightmarish example, so I've spent 5 years building up 100,000 Twitter followers. That has real value to me in terms of my outreach, my influence, my career, selling books or whatever. Twitter could potentially shut me down arbitrarily tomorrow if they decide I've said something they don't like, and I basically have no recourse. So that's an example of big tech rather than government kind of stealing value from you.
Yes.
And of course, they've written their terms and conditions in a way that, in a narrow technical legal sense, that's their right to do it.
Right.
But from a kind of broader biological social perspective, that's as much an act of violence against, my extended phenotype as, government kind of seizing my property if they, unfairly claim it was involved in some kind of shady deal, or it's just as much of a phenotype handicapping event as, the Fed printing trillions of dollars and sucking the value out of my bank account.
Right. Such a unique way to look at it. I love it. Is there a biological equivalent of this or an analog of government in nature? I mean, you mentioned the term parasite. I know that, clearly there's parasites in nature. I don't know, maybe you could just speak a little bit to that, the dynamic that we have today. Like we just have an excess of parasiticism, if that's a word, from the government because of fiat currency? Like, is it we have an imbalance that's something maybe you wouldn't see in nature, or is this perfectly normal?
I think it's fair to say that government is kind of relatively new on the scene and on a kind of evolutionary timescale. You don't really see examples of social structures above the level of like fairly small groups in social primates. You might have a chimp troop of like 30 individuals, and there is a dominance hierarchy, and the kind of top ranked chimps kind of help resolve conflicts and kind of keep the peace and provide some kind of social stability, but they also get reproductive and food benefits in return. And so there's kind of a governance model, but basically there is actually some interesting evolutionary psychology work on leadership and followership. Like, what benefits do members of a tribe get from kind of respecting like one person, alpha male or whatever, as kind of the peacekeeper, the decision maker, the adjudicator of conflicts. And there's kind of a notion that like a rational individual in a tribe would actually be willing to pay, a little bit of their excess food or respect, or even like mating opportunities to an effective, competent, good leader in exchange for the whole tribe, benefiting from good leadership.
Right.
And I think that totally makes sense. It's just like, every effective corporation has a CEO that's the chief decision maker.
Yeah. And
has some hierarchy of command and control. There's no effective military force in the world that's like a flat hierarchy.
Right. Yes.
That just doesn't work. Those, anarchic barbarians have been completely outclassed and outcompeted by people who could form effective hierarchies.
Right.
But I think the scale of the hierarchy now, having governments that kind of organize societies and economies for hundreds of millions of people and that take like 40% of GDP, that's new.
Right.
And I think that's largely parasitic and not, we're not getting value from money there, in my opinion, as a kind of lifelong libertarian.
Yes. So it makes me think of that old saying where they say, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. So in times of stability, you kind of want flatter, more decentralized hierarchy because that is more sustainable over time. But in times of volatility or crisis, you kind of need decentralized decision making to go one way or another. And I think government, in my study of it, government arose in the agricultural age. Basically, once we started creating economic surplus, we had created something worth stealing. Other tribes would want to steal the food or tools or whatever they may be. So that necessitated the creation of a protection producing enterprise. But the problem with it is that, so then you have a local monopolist on violence. The problem with that, though, is that they always, because they're a monopolist, they always end up charging monopoly prices for the protection from violence. And that usually means they start wielding violence over those they're supposed to protect. So is there any, and again, this gets back to that defensibility of property thing. It's like the more we can make property independent of government or costly for government to seize, the more civil we would become. Am I thinking about that correctly?
Yeah, I haven't quite connected that sort of protection racket thinking to like the promise of crypto before, but I think that totally makes sense. Once, I think the warlord is like the basic default system of governance, like the warlord plus lieutenants and sergeants running a local protection racket. That's basically like what everything defaults to if there's a failed state.
Right.
You don't get anarchy. You get anarchy for like a week, and then you get warlords.
Yes.
And you get warlords saying, I will help protect your property for a price from that other local warlord who would charge an even higher price.
Yes.
So yeah, it's kind of like a monopoly, and you could replace me, but it'll just be some other guy who's even worse.
Yeah.
That depends on individuals and their property being vulnerable to certain kinds of theft or expropriation. And the harder the theft is, the less leverage the warlord or the government has over you. Now, the problem is, we're physically embodied. So your local government always has a kind of monopoly over the use of force against your phenotype proper, your actual body.
Yes.
And the ability to imprison you or execute you or exile you or whatever. But if you can at least make most forms of your extended phenotype, your property, relatively insulated from that, then you've taken away a lot of power that government has over you.
Right.
And people tend to have this instinctive aversion to seeing, governments like beat, torture, abuse, and kill other individuals' bodies. So modern governments tend to like avoid the PR issues that come from that.
Yeah, right. Yes.
And like they mostly use systems of control over your reputation and your money.
Right.
Rather than your physical body. So I think one of the promises of crypto, whether it's Bitcoin or Ethereum or Cardano or Algorand or whatever it is it just removes many of the tools in the government's armory for exerting control over you. And so, of course, that's why governments are freaked out by crypto. They understand perfectly well what the stakes are. And I think kind of privately, a lot of them are kind of in full panic mode. Once the full implications of crypto become apparent to them, and that they can no longer be the monopoly warlord protection racket.
Yeah.
That's probably like an existential threat to their power, of course.
Right.
And Bitcoiners understand this better than most government functionaries or politicians do at this point.
Yeah.
And hopefully they'll still be blindsided, but they might catch up and they might, crack down.
Right. Yeah. So I like the way you put that a lot. So, and I think Mises said this well, that no government can remain unpopular for long, right? That's sort of the nature of government. Even the despots, they depend on acceptance by the people, because they're just the people ultimately have the power, whether they realize it or not throughout history. It ultimately rests with them. And to your point, therefore they are more incentivized to attack you through money or reputation than overt violence. They've kind of, especially in the digital age, right, where we have all transparency is really high. You do. Well, I describe this too, where like the MLK, when Martin Luther King marched in Alabama, he wasn't the first guy to do that. But when it was televised and millions of people saw it, that's what started driving the legislative change and the civil rights movement. So the media, the technology landscape really influences how the human collective responds to these changes. And one thing, so Bitcoin too is interesting here because not only does it give you, it's reducing that attack vector on your money, right? You hold your savings in Bitcoin, do it properly, it can't be touched or seized. I don't know if you've heard about these other experiments taking place. I'm sure you've heard of the Lightning Network, which is the transaction layer for Bitcoin. There's an app called Sphinx Chat that actually my podcast is published to, and it's built on top of the Lightning Network so that this podcast is effectively uncensorable. Once it's put up, it's anchored on the Lightning Network, it's transmitted via sats, and it can't really be taken down. So I think Bitcoin also holds this great promise to renew the original hope for the internet, to decentralize media and make speech unstoppable and all of these things. Do you have thought? So clear, that's an existential threat to government. Do you have thoughts on how the parasite might respond from a biological standpoint? I mean, if it sees the writing on the wall, how bad do you think things will get?
I think there's a worrying move where there's kind of like a critical mass of governments that have started to kind of sort of understand the crypto threat to their hegemony and their legitimacy and their popularity. It's not yet, I think, perceived as an overwhelming threat. I think if, the number of people who held Bitcoin increased like 10x and it got into like the low billions rather than hundreds of millions, that would start to get their attention. If I think in a way, like the US government seems to be using the legacy finance system as kind of like an indicator or a signal of how big is the threat of crypto. So as long as like the mainstream banking system and credit card system and payment networks and all of that are still kind of looking similar to what they were 10 or 20 years ago, they probably won't freak out that much. But I think if crypto starts making serious inroads into creating other secure, decentralized, uncensorable systems, like new kinds of social media where you can't suddenly be demonetized by YouTube, or new kinds of NFTs where your ownership of some art or music is secured on a blockchain and not dependent on some like legacy art provenance proof system. This is kind of salient to me because my daughter is a professional artist and she interacts with the art world. Or property rights. If we got to a point, hypothetically, where real estate agents started really becoming unemployed and people were just buying and selling houses based on some alternative system that didn't involve kind of traditional title searches and mortgages and all of that stuff. I think, frankly, most people in government don't have the imagination or capacity for abstraction to really understand how much of a threat crypto is yet. Maybe in a way, once enough of them get kind of greedy enough at a personal and family level that they go, we really should invest like 10% of our net worth in some kind of crypto. Then they'll start to learn about it, the way I did this year.
Yeah.
And then they might start going down the rabbit hole and listen to your podcasts and whatever. And then, then the light might go on. But hopefully by that point, they'll be so invested in it that they might go, they might have like mixed motives, as the game theorists call it. And they might not act purely in the interests of the US government at that point.
It's so interesting you put it that way. That maps almost perfectly to my theory, actually, that I see it because Bitcoin is individually accessible and ultimately everyone's acting in their own personal self-interest, that you get kind of forced into Bitcoin over time, at an individual level. And then once you're holding some of this asset, it really changes your incentives and your perception of it, right? What this calls to mind is that selective attention experiment I'm sure you've heard of, where they pass the basketball back and forth. You're supposed to watch the number of passes. You miss the gorilla. So your evaluations, or I guess your objectives or goals actually determine how you see the world. So if all of a sudden these politicians are holding Bitcoin, they're going to just look at the world differently. And I see Bitcoin as dissolving these power structures from within by exactly that sequence you just described. And I wonder too, if the cost benefit, when I'm thinking about it from a government standpoint, they can't remain unpopular for long. Anytime they try to clamp down on it, they can seize it off centralized exchanges, I guess, but there's always going to be this diehard cohort of Bitcoiners, these anarcho-capitalists that have it custodied properly and will, fight to the death for it. And I think that obstinate minority becomes really hard for government to resist. They kind of capitulate to the preferences of the minority over time.
Yeah, but I mean, in a way, you can already see how freaked out government is, because on your IRS 1040 form now, there's that question, that big question, do you now or have you ever owned any cryptocurrency or traded in it? And like, there's no other asset class that they ask that about, within the first 2 inches of the 1040 form.
Yeah.
And so obviously it's partly a signal that's designed to intimidate.
Yeah.
And it's designed to create the impression that you are extra likely to be audited.
Yes.
If you own crypto. And if you don't use your, crypto accounting software, tax preparation software accurately, then you're going to be in trouble. And they don't ask, do you own, an index tracking stock fund or, bonds or any you own NFTs, they don't care.
Yes.
I think that's one of the little clues that, the IRS is sort of starting to understand the threat. So yeah, one possible tipping point is, okay, enough politicians, enough people in the deep state, enough bureaucrats start to own Bitcoin that they've got skin in the game and they're not going to undermine their family's financial security for the sake of just imposing regulations that are somehow in the aggregate better for the government they happen to work for.
Yeah. I'm really glad you put it that way, because I've been struggling to articulate it a bit, but that helped me a lot. So property is an extension of the phenotype. Money is the highest form of property. Bitcoin is the best form of money. So we've created with Bitcoin this, I don't know, seizure resistant extended phenotype.
Yeah, it's funny because it kind of puts human beings in this weird state where it's kind of like, on the one hand, there's your genetic information, which is absolutely crucial. And on the other hand, there's your private keys.
Yes.
To your crypto. And everything that happens in between is just sort of meat space nonsense.
Wow.
And you're, to the extent that your private keys eventually could cover most forms of value that matter to you. For example, anything from your actual Bitcoiny money, digital store of gold, to your property rights in real physical property, to your academic credentials. Or I've kind of had this fantasy that as a university professor, you could put all of your papers, your research, your writing up on a secure decentralized blockchain, and you could have, citations and references to it, and maybe even commercial applications of it. And then you would have a kind of decentralized intellectual property ecosystem. Science could operate sort of on a blockchain-based system. So basically everything that matters to you as an individual in terms of your extended phenotype, whatever forms that takes, could be cryptographically secured. And that means the attack vectors that government has against you, or even that other people have against you, like if you get mobbed or canceled, or your political beliefs become ideologically unwelcome, you'd also be relatively safe against that kind of thing.
Wow. So that's a cool way to look at it. Your private keys are almost as important as your genetic code. Sounds like a pretty significant human invention.
I think so. And, I have kind of the zeal of the convert in terms of being a crypto newbie. So I might be over enthused about this. I've been known to get my sort of enthusiasms carry me away sometimes. But on the other hand, at least tens of millions of other people seem to be pretty committed and excited about this, including most of the really smart people I know.
Yes. Yeah. I think that in this space, the enthusiasm actually just seems to increase. The further down the rabbit hole you go, the more interesting it becomes. So we left off talking about on that IRS form, the first line, do you own crypto? Is that then a form of signaling? Like this parasite is signaling to the host, hey, we know what you're up to. You're trying to, we see that you can almost, I guess, call Bitcoin kind of like a parasiticide in a way, right? It's sort of poisoning to the parasite or reducing the parasite's ability to feast on the host. Is that then the IRS or the government then signaling to the host organism, like, be careful what you do because I will attack you in different ways?
Oh, absolutely. I think in a system where government operates largely through sort of indoctrination and propaganda and veiled threats and these sort of signals, you can move markets. You can create fear, uncertainty, and doubt, or FUD. And FUD is a signal, and often it's a highly engineered signal. Sometimes it's engineered by whales, big investors. Sometimes it's engineered by governments or mainstream media. I think it's very important for investors and everybody in the crypto space to have a kind of realistic sense of how that signaling system operates. Because, in an ideal world, different crypto projects would attract investment in proportion to their kind of long-term real value to actual people doing real things. But given market psychology as it works, everybody's very, very uncertain about the long-term value of most of these projects. What's the natural value of Bitcoin? Is it $100,000? Is it $100 million in 100 years? It's very, very hard to tell. So some of your signals that you rely on come from other investors in the form of like short-term price signals, support and resistance levels, and whatever the technical analysts are talking about. Some of it is government signals, like whatever Elizabeth Warren says, and of course, mainstream asset markets are not immune to this. I mean, when the Fed is about to make a major announcement about interest rates, Wall Street pays attention, and that moves markets, and that's a signal. And the Fed knows that it's a signal, and they treat it very cautiously because they know it will have billions and billions of dollars of impact. So I think the more that everybody understands about signaling theory, the better.
So what could you, when we look at it that way, it's almost like all organisms and organizations and entities is just constantly signaling, right? We're constantly putting out signals, receiving signals, interpreting signals, modifying our own signals based on the signals we've taken in, pushing them back out. So there's just this dynamical system updating itself through signals. Where, I mean, where does this originate? This we could also talk about, I guess, virtue signaling as part of this as well, which is the title of your upcoming book. What are we doing with all this signaling? Is this just Darwinian coordination mechanism? And how do virtue signals fit into that as well? Because another thing we didn't mention, but I think the IRS or the power structures that be, they try to virtue signal against crypto and Bitcoin. Drug dealers, terrorists, whatever, money laundering. Maybe you could just describe signaling theory, how it fits into Darwinism, and then maybe intro us to virtue signaling.
So yeah, we've already talked about a number of the signaling systems, like the peacock's tail is the sexual ornament that attracts potential mates. Luxury goods, as analyzed by Thorsten Veblen, show your ability to burn money on conspicuous, relatively useless stuff. And the point of buying the luxury good is not that Rolex makes a better watch than a Timex, digital watch for $10, but rather that they've created common knowledge among everyone. Rolex is expensive. James Bond wears Rolex until Omega took over that franchise. And that, so they've created common knowledge that this is supposed to be prestigious and high status. Yeah. And we've talked about educational credentials as signals. People might feel, there's a lot of American bourgeois parents who are kind of a little embarrassed to buy a Porsche for themselves, but are not at all embarrassed to talk about, I sent my kid to Columbia or Stanford or whatever.
Right.
Which costs more than a Porsche.
Yeah.
So signaling in general depends on this game theoretic principle that it's got to be hard to fake in order to be reliable. So it needs to have this property that if you didn't have the underlying trait that was being signaled, you wouldn't be able to send the signal consistently or reliably or in a way that was kind of socially recognized. So it's Olympic, week in Tokyo this week, and awesome athletes are getting awarded gold medals for incredible stuff they do. Now, the gold medal itself is not that hard to fake. You could get some metallurgist to create your personal gold medal, and you could claim, I won the decathlon or the air pistol or whatever. But it's extremely easy for someone to check. You go on a first date, you claim to be a gold medalist. They go home, they Google you. Like, no, you didn't win it.
Right.
So it's hard to fake in the sense that the information is out there.
It's cheap to verify.
Cheap to verify. It's hard to fake. So in the information age, a lot of signals take that kind of quality, that there's decentralized information, that's easy to Google, and you can check, someone's credentials. You can check like how many citations exist to my scientific work. You can go to Google Scholar and check it. It takes 5 minutes. You can see, Miller has this many citations, somebody else has this many. So any kind of signaling where the information's reliable about some underlying quality of interest, and it's hard to fake it if you don't have that quality, that's reliable signal. Now, when it comes to virtue signaling, that's a particular kind of signal. It's usually, social or sexual, that says, I have a particular kind of moral personality. I have certain ethically relevant traits like honesty or integrity or like sexual fidelity, or I will show up on time with my webcam working properly or whatever it is. And so anything that people evaluate using their kind of moral psychology, like, is that a good person or a bad person? Are they reliable or are they flaky? Would they make a good long-term sexual partner? Or are they kind of exploitative, manipulative, psychopathic, whatever? Virtue signals are anything that let you send those bits of information about your kind of moral character to potential sexual partner, or to a friend or a colleague or coworker, or to a group, or to a potential employer or investor, or anybody who wants to evaluate your moral character. Then it's worth sending a hard to fake virtue signal.
Interesting. So it's, back to this cheap versus expensive form of signaling. The cheap form is not reliable because it can be produced ad infinitum. It's not necessarily truthful, whereas the expensive form, again, it incurs that cost or proof of work, so it tends to be more reliable. And this is interesting, again, just to relate it to money, because money is very similar. Money is a communication medium. If it's cheap to produce, it's not reliable. That's what fiat currency is. That's why it goes to zero. But if it's hard to produce, like gold or Bitcoin, it tends to be more reliable, both in its sustainability as a monetary system, and it transmits more reliable signals that you're actually, conveying that you really put work and energy into it.
Yeah.
With virtue, though, virtue is such a nebulous kind of thing. How are we? So the first point I think I noticed from your book is that it's not necessarily negative. Like when we say virtue signaling, or we hear that in the media, I think it's universally considered negative, like someone's faking their virtue, basically. But you can also do it authentically, right? You can actually have virtue and really just be exhibiting the patterns of behavior that virtue involves authentically, I guess you might say. But what is the difference between cheap and expensive virtue signaling then? Because you could very clearly, if it's just words, you just say whatever, I'm honest, I'm great, versus the expensive version would be action. How do you distinguish between the two?
I think there's some really interesting kind of game theoretic nuances here that might be worth exploring for a few minutes. So for a signal to be reliable, it needs to be hard to fake, but that can take multiple forms. That can include like physically expensive in terms of materials, energy, resources, time, or risk. But something could also be hard to fake by virtue of a distributed social consensus around the value of something. Okay, so for example, let's take a pop star like Billie Eilish. Okay, she's got a new album out today or whatever. So she's got tens of millions of followers and intense fans, and they have a view that she's a cool musician. Okay. Does it cost Billie Eilish anything in particular in terms of like proof of work to attain that reputation? Yes, it does certainly cost, some creativity and time invested and conscientiousness and, collaborating with her brother to produce this music and doing the sound engineering. But her social reputation as a musician is not really in proportion to that amount of work. It's in proportion to how well does it hit the psychological buttons of the listeners in terms of making them excited and making them feel like I'm participating in a little subculture or fandom around this musician, right? So somebody who invested, equal amounts of work into their musical career may or may not achieve the same level of kind of consensual success. So fame is funny like that. Fame is a reliable signal of at least how many people have heard of you.
Yeah.
How much brain space do you kind of have collectively across the culture? And to me, that's a little bit like proof of stake, dare I say it. Proof of stake isn't exactly fame-like. It might be a little more similar to like the reputation of a scientist that's based on how often their work gets cited by other scientists.
Right.
Okay. Some of the papers I've produced that have been most cited, like I had the first paper I ever did, which was on designing neural networks with genetic algorithms. First paper I ever published, age 24 in grad school, cited more than 1,000 times. By far the most impactful scientific paper I've ever done. It didn't honestly take that much work to do. It just happened to be like somewhat insightful and one of the first things published in that area. So it kind of got a big first mover advantage. And so everyone cites it, and everyone else who goes into that space knows that, like, oh, that's one of those papers you kind of have to cite. And is it fair? Maybe not really, but there is an objective reality about the kind of consensual respect that certain, scientific papers or ideas have. So you can get reliable signaling that's relatively cheap in terms of resources, but that's still very hard to fake because the information that it draws upon is very decentralized. And where you wouldn't, like, nobody has the leverage to kind of fake the required number of, like, music fans or the required number of citations. So there's some systemic, like, honesty system involved.
Right.
And I think this is where I have a little bit of a difference of opinion with some of the really hardcore, like, Bitcoin maximalists who are like, there's no way you can secure money other than energy invested. Maybe they're right, but there might be other ways to secure value in a highly social species like ours, because we already do that in lots and lots of ways through systems like reputation or systems like, voting. I mean, democratic voting systems are, like, more or less reliable most of the time, in some countries at least.
Yeah, that's super interesting way to look at it. So I think that, so there's the work itself, the energy expenditure creating some value, but there's also the possibility of this value that's derived from the network consensus, right? If other people enjoy Billie Eilish's music, then all of a sudden you feel like you're part of this group and you're deriving value from others deriving value from the music. So you get this emergent property or something more than the sum of its parts, right? By being kind of a network effect, I guess you might say. So there's some value derived from the network participation. A lot of that accretes back to the artist. And this is something I've always thought is so interesting. I guess you'd say this is brand or reputational value, right? A lot of that accretes to the artist or the creator, but they themselves do not control it. They have some influence over their brand. They have some influence over their reputation. They can make kind of good moral decisions and perform well and all these things. But at the end of the day, they don't actually control that consensus, right? It is distributed. All their fans could decide. And it doesn't have to be it doesn't have to be the artist's fault. Some other artist could come along that's better, and maybe all their fans just leave for the new, better artist. So it's this interesting dynamic where it's your greatest asset as a creator, your reputation or your brand, but it's an asset you don't control at the end of the day. So, and I liked how you said it's how much brain space you occupy in the fans or the audience, because that gets back to kind of territoriality, right? There's a limited amount of attention in the world. Creators are all competing to get eyeballs and time, basically. And it's a territorial race. And then maybe there is some connection here to proof of stake, because here's where I'm at with proof of stake. As you mentioned with your paper, it had this first mover advantage. So it had kind of a winner take all dynamic, and that it got a ton of citations in maybe what we'd call in markets like a blue ocean market. Maybe you were breaking some new academic space and it became kind of a route to a broader branching of knowledge. The problem with proof of stake, in my mind, as I understand it, is that it is inherently centralizing. So it's like the more you have, the more you gain, right? So it doesn't, whereas proof of work would be distributive to wealth, like the more work you actually do in the system, the more you share in the proceeds of that wealth creation. Proof of stake would be the opposite, actually. It's just the larger claim you have, the larger your claim will grow. So what that does is it rips the system apart. Central banking is proof of stake, by the way. It's whoever has the gold gets to print the most money, right? I have the most gold, so I get to run the most irresponsible monetary policy. And what does that do to the middle class of the largest dominant central bank, like the Fed? It rips society apart. You get richer, the rich get richer, the poor get poorer. But that it's, sorry, go ahead.
I don't think that's quite right. So let's compare like a gold standard system to a fiat system, right?
Yeah.
So gold system, yeah, whoever has the gold kind of has the legitimacy to print the money that's supposed to represent the gold. And as long as people can kind of check on that equation, and is that link still valid?
As long as they have the option to redeem.
The option to redeem. But once you sever that link, in arguably whenever that happened, 1933 or 1971 or whatever, then you're back to a system where government basically has just the monopoly on the use of force to say, you have to use our fiat to pay the taxes to us or else we throw you in jail.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That's ultimately that's the the proof of jailability really is
force,
what
right.
Legitimates the fiat currency. And I think it's still kind of an open question, an empirical question, whether proof of work or proof of stake or other kinds of proof are going to end up being more or less decentralized. Like I remember kind of vaguely hearing about Bitcoin, 10 years ago. And I thought this is really cool because it sounds like anybody, with a home laptop will be able to mine this stuff. And that's cool because everybody has a laptop and that sounds totally decentralized. Mm-hmm. But then you get special purpose mining rigs that mean it's actually not economically viable for the mining, at least, to be as decentralized as one might have hoped. And that's just kind of a technological contingency, that it happened to like play out that way. You could in principle have had technology develop in a way that, everyone's laptop was like good enough at turning electricity into Bitcoin that it's worth doing. So it's just kind of happenstance that you get highly centralized mining, at least in the last few years, of Bitcoin. And it is, so I think it's really, really hard to make kind of a priori judgments about some of these issues about what is actually going to be the most decentralized. If enough people buy into proof of stake platforms around the world, if everyone who's kind of in the global middle class invest like 20% of their net wealth in crypto, then I think proof of stake would be really seriously decentralized. Like it would be really, really hard for any small group of actors to dominate it, because the aggregate wealth of the middle class is vastly greater than the aggregate wealth of the highly rich.
Well, so my question is this, though. Let's just hypothetically say that all wealth is stored in some proof of stake money. Proof of stake pays a yield that is commensurate to your holdings, right? So the larger your stack, the more percentage you get of that. How does that not create more wealth disparity over time? Like clearly the upper cohort in that hierarchy of wealth is going to be earning, I guess, if that's the word you want to use, a disproportionate share of the total wealth in the hierarchy. So the bottom cohort is going to be pushed further down as the top of the cohort gets increasingly rich. How does that not self-destruct?
Well, okay, so if everyone who owns a particular crypto asset gets, like, let's say, staking rewards in proportion to how much they have, then everyone who's in the asset at all increases their net worth by the same amount proportionally, right? The big economic inequality is between those who own the asset at all versus those who don't.
Well, that's what I'm saying. In this hypothetical example, let's just assume it's just one. There's one money. It's Ethereum proof of stake globally. Everyone's using Ethereum. It's all proof of stake based. How does that higher, and assume there's an uneven distribution of wealth, as there always is, especially with Ethereum. How does that hierarchy of wealth not become more divergent, more top heavy and bottom heavy over time?
I might be wrong, but I think the math works out that just if everyone's net wealth is increasing at like the same amount, let's whatever 5% a year or whatever your staking rewards are, then
but that's the point. The rewards, if let's say there's zero economic growth too, just to keep it simple, the rewards, who's paying the rewards, is that it flows to the top, but it's coming out of the middle and the bottom. This is how central banking is proof of stake built on top of gold's proof of work, is my point. So I think it fundamentally does not work.
Okay, so I think this is, if you've, and this is where my newbiness as a crypto enthusiast is going to start becoming like painfully apparent to all the Bitcoin maximalists
Totally
who've
fine.
been in this space for 10 years. So don't brigade me too hard on this. But I think there will be a fundamental difference between crypto projects that provide an actual use case that does something good for people economically, like it actually makes it easier to do a real estate transaction, or it's a payment processing system that actually makes it more efficient than Visa or PayPal, or it's something that helps you secure your educational credentials in a way that are hard to fake, or your work history or whatever.
Yeah.
So there's a set of things that have an actual use case where people are willing to, pay to get the benefit of, the crypto project. Maybe Chainlink's a good example. Like if you actually provide a good connection between, crypto platforms and objective real world data, and those are like verifiable in a decentralized way, then Chainlink, insofar as it succeeds, will provide valuable, data to other crypto projects, and therefore it should be able to pay staking rewards in proportion to its value. On the other hand, right, if you have a crypto project that it's doing sweet F all, it's not actually doing anything other than being like a store of value alternative to Bitcoin, right? That's just a Ponzi scheme. Absolutely. And that's an engine for creating wealth inequalities and volatility and misery. So I think I agree about that.
Yeah, I will see that. I'm not versed enough in I will say they are prospective value propositions of these coins, because I don't think anything is market proven at this point. Nothing has succeeded in the marketplace besides Bitcoin, I would argue. And I'll loosely define success right now to quantify it as above $100 billion in realized capitalization. And that's a threshold Bitcoin only crossed in August 2019. So it's relatively newly successful by the metric I'm laying out. I will see that perhaps one of those use cases could be first of all discovered and then satisfied using some proof of stake or alternative distributed consensus mechanism. However, I do not think it's possible to have a monetary system not based on proof of work. I think it's just you're in thermodynamic reality that you have to assure the supply fixity of 21 million. you have to require energy expenditure to secure that network. It's part of it's almost biological, I guess you would say. You're constraining anyone from breaking the credibility of Bitcoin's supply assurance. And if that is relaxed even in the slightest in any way, someone's going to exploit that attack vector in one way or another. So it's very simple, kind of a hard and fast rule. And this is where Bitcoiners get so obstinate and passionate about it. In my opinion, I think I see what they're saying with it. You have to have energy expenditure to make sure it's 21 million. And I'm not saying there's absolutely never going to be an alternative, but to the extent of human knowledge today, there is no alternative.
I think I probably 80 or 90% agree with you about that. Like in terms of just a pure store of value cryptocurrency proper.
Mm-hmm.
I think proof of work has a lot going for it. The only crypto I would invest in is one that has one of these other specific use cases and where they're kind of competing against some legacy system that we know is already making money. Mm-hmm. Right? We know Visa as a company, as a payment processor, is already making money processing payments. So something that challenges that incumbent could potentially, make some money, not as much as Visa, or else they wouldn't be cheaper, but they'll make something. We know that there are many, many industries in society that could potentially be kind of blockchainified or cryptographically secured and decentralized. Social media is another example, right?
Yeah. If
somebody invents a really strong form of social media that is uncensorable and secure, and we're like, I know if I put up, my YouTube videos on there, nobody can take them down. That's a real value proposition, and people, should be able to pay for that, and that's a revenue generator, and it's real.
Yes.
So I think it makes sense to separate like the money function, the store value function, from the vast universe of other economic activity that we do, that some of which could potentially be based on blockchain.
I agree, except I would add that the decentralization feature, like if you're trying to create something that can't be censored, social media, messaging, whatever, you have to build that on Bitcoin. That's an inherently, you never want to have the second most secure censorship resistance, right? This is just like government, right? Government's sort of inherently centralizing because as they are the monopolist on violence, when one government encounters another one and they go to war, one conquers the other one, everyone's going to want to be under the protection of the guy that won. Because if you're under the protection of the guy that lost, you're always vulnerable to the protection of the guy that won. So when it comes to blockchain security, you always want to build your uncensorable product on the longest, most energy dense and rigid chain. And that's what Bitcoin is. So I'd add that there might be alternative use cases for alternative crypto assets, but if you're truly looking for decentralization or money, then it's got to be built on Bitcoin. And so that's a lot of it. That's a lot of the use cases, I think, for distributed consensus. And that's why this is, I think, the framework for Bitcoin maximalists. And I know you said you're new in 2021. Everyone comes in and we get lost in the jungle with all these different ideas. A lot of people come back to Bitcoin over time. That's where I'm at today. But it's such a new space that you can't say for certainty nothing will ever work. But there are very strong arguments in favor of Bitcoin being a winner take most, at least.
Yeah. I mean, the thing. So just to make clear my kind of position on this, I think Bitcoin's awesome. I think Satoshi was a genius. I think if it's possible to award Nobel Prizes to anonymous inventors, like he, she, they should definitely get, Nobel Prize for Bitcoin. I think it's a fabulous investment. I hope it succeeds in becoming like the globally dominant store of value. I think the political implications of that, the social implications are fascinating, and it would be absolutely revolutionary. I think it would seriously undermine the oppressiveness of most governments. I think it would dramatically increase standards of living throughout the world, particularly in countries that are subject to kind of crazy inflation and volatility and economic oppression and governments just straight up stealing their cash and their property.
Yes.
So that's all awesome. And then around the margins, we can kind of argue like, are there other legit use cases for crypto that could be revolutionary in other ways? And if so, what are the best ways to secure value on those chains? I don't know. I'm kind of more of an agnostic about that second question.
Yeah, I try and I run a fund in the space. I've looked at hundreds of these deals, and I hold 100% Bitcoin today. It's all I can say is I've tried to test multiple theories, and over time, I guess like anything else, kind of Darwinian in a way. You test all this different variation. If you keep coming back to one solution, you tend to become a little bit more reinforced in that. So I have to ask you, was that virtue signaling just now?
That was mostly trying to avoid being, brigaded by the maxis on Twitter.
Yeah, well,
that has happened to me over the last few months, once in a while.
It's happened to me as well. So,
and I love those guys, but there's the ones who are like virtuously, earnestly excited, about Bitcoin's huge social, political, economic potential. And then there's like the group of like hardcore sadistic trolls who just kind of love making.
Yes.
How dare you invest in that shitcoin, Miller? What are you doing?
Yes.
And I have no time for the trolls. But on the other hand, I've been in that kind of maximalist position before with regard to other issues, right? So a lot of people consider evolutionary psychologists like the moral equivalent of Bitcoin maxis with regard to like the nature-nurture issue.
Oh, interesting. Could you expand on that?
Basically, we're like, whatever information it's useful for an organism to have, it will tend to internalize into its genome and make it as robust as possible against environmental disruption, right? And one implication of that is that when an organism's growing from a fertilized egg, it should try to be relatively hardened and stabilized and anti-fragile against environmental disruption, including parental or social influences.
Interesting.
Right. So people will say, that's genetic determinism, bad, morally bad. But to me, it's sort of just like, that's what evolution would tend to do with useful information, is like compile it down into the genotype in the most reliable, hard to fake way. And the idea that humans would grow as sort of a blank slate that's really vulnerable to any kind of environmental inputs or traumas or parenting or whatever, seems like wildly implausible. So I've been in the position, of defending a view that sounds like almost psychotically extreme to most people.
Yeah.
So I understand the social dynamics of being a maximalist, because I've been in that position with regard to lots of things I'm interested in: evolutionary psychology, behavior genetics. I do a lot of research on intelligence and like IQ, and people get very uncomfortable with that. They're like, there's multiple intelligences. It's not general intelligence. And I'm like, it's mostly general intelligence. And so, I understand what it's like to be the sort of righteous, like beleaguered minority that's got the truth on their side. It's just, I think we all have a moral responsibility not to be too trollish when we're in that position, as much flack as we've gotten in the past,
So that's interesting. So a culture itself is an organism, right? Or it's a super organism, a collective organism, whatever you want to call it. And when a culture is emergent, right, it's kind of fighting for its initial little rooting of territoriality, trying to carve out some space for itself. It needs to exhibit this extremist, obstinate, this anti-fragile characteristics, as you called it. I think of like a sapling, like a little seed trying to get out of the earth. It's got to go hard and scrap. It's really got to fight to get out of the earth. But then once it starts to establish roots, it forms this kind of big solid trunk. It doesn't need to fight and be so extreme anymore. It's just, it depends on its own stability. So there's this, maybe this is kind of like a bootstrapping process, or like a computer's running very deterministic, specific programs early on. That's just telling it, how do you run this program? And how do you run this program? And each program is kind of steadily more complex until the computer fully boots up. And then we have all this freedom and choice. My computer right now, it's not deterministic. It's doing whatever it's interfacing with me. It gives me a lot of freedom, I guess you would say. But I don't have a lot of freedom over the bootstrapping process. I just press power and it does its thing. So,
I mean, to use your analogy, I think, the state we're in is like, if you're the sapling, you've got to be scrappy. You've got to grow as fast as you possibly can to, outcompete the other saplings. You've got to grab your share of the light.
yes.
You've got to grow to tree size, or die. Now, every mature tree, if it had any memory, would be like, it really sucked to be a sapling. I still have wounds, emotional wounds from my saplinghood, and I've got a chip on my shoulder about being a sapling. And a lot of the Bitcoin maxis kind of strike me as like, you guys are the giant redwood, like you're $1 trillion dominant crypto, and you're still carrying around these ancient wounds from whatever 2014 when your parents made fun of you. And it's time to get over it and grow up and just enjoy your success and realize the threats to the redwood are not upcoming saplings or newbies who want to dance around the saplings or invest in Cardano or Chainlink. The threats are the lumberjacks,
the loggers,
from the Fed or the government who have noticed you're starting to soak up a bunch of the sunlight.
Yeah.
And you're really messing with their monopoly. That's the enemy.
Yes.
Crypto newbies who are like, maybe I'm 70% in Bitcoin, but I want to spread some money around to other places. Like, that's not your enemy.
Yes.
And so they lose money on some projects you consider shitcoins. So what? As long as they're invested in this space, which we all hope will succeed, amazingly.
Yes.
Then we'll all be fine.
So I agree that the cultural immune system, which is necessary for survival, this is what they commonly call Bitcoin toxicity. It does need to be directed at the actual threats to the core protocol itself, which at this point I think are largely state level actors, state level threats. It's $1 trillion asset. So I think it's a great way to look at it. That it's a very necessary feature for survival. Indeed, there would be no Bitcoin without it. It sheltered it in the early days and it helped it survive. There were threats to Bitcoin, multiple political and protocol level threats that the toxicity helped it survive. So it's critical to its success, but now it needs to be reoriented towards the new matrix of threats that it faces. I agree with that.
Yeah, it's pick whatever analogy you want. You could do a military analogy that, like, you don't want to fight the last World War. You want to anticipate the upcoming threats that are based on new types of attacks. You don't want to have a bunch of like aircraft carriers vulnerable to hypersonic anti-ship ballistic missiles in an era when anti-ship ballistic missiles exist. You don't want to have a military that is a whole bunch of hardware that's extremely vulnerable to cyber attacks. You don't want to have a Bitcoin ecosystem that might be extremely good at defending their protocol against inflation, let's say, but that has no lobbying power in Washington, no effective PR, no journalists on your side, no ability to handle FUD in a sustained or effective or fast-moving way. Like, those are the real threats.
Yeah.
And I think every maturing industry, realizes at a certain point, you have to have public relations, you have to have lobbyists, you have to engage with the public at an effective psychological level that protects your protocol from like adverse public reaction. And I don't see that being done all that effectively yet by the crypto industry. And that's one, not that I could have that much of a role in it, but I think there is a role for behavioral sciences in kind of helping like connect the crypto industry as it is to the general public and where they are in terms of their understanding of it. Because crypto is one of the most counterintuitive technologies ever developed. It's extremely hard to wrap your head around. It took me months before I even started, to get a glimmer of understanding. And I'm a pretty smart guy with a pretty good understanding of economics and game theory. And if it took me a while, your average like, working class or middle class person without that kind of background, they really need a lot of help.
Yes.
A lot of warm, supportive help.
Yes.
Not being kind of lectured at or.
Yes. Yeah. I did. I agree with you completely. I was on a podcast earlier where there's this belief in the toxic Bitcoin maximalist cohort that none of it matters. Bitcoin's inevitable. And it's like, okay, I sort of somewhat agree that I think the economic incentives of Bitcoin will cause it to succeed no matter what. But the shape and the details of its success and who it ends up influencing and impacting, I think we have a large degree of control over. And I was on this show earlier today with a guy, and he was speaking about the toxic culture as well. He's like, could you imagine looking, a middle class, he was an African-American guy I was doing the show with. He's like, could you imagine looking an African-American woman in the eyes and telling her, have fun staying poor? And it's like that element of culture, although it may have served a purpose to preserve the core protocol, is decreasingly relevant as Bitcoin grows and interfaces with more and more cultures, right? Bitcoin evolves past its own toxic culture in a way. And I'm with you. I hope to be on the forefront of that evolution, right? Like I'll always have respect for the toxicity and what they got us this far. But here is the other way to think about it, is that if Bitcoin is just an internet protocol, and we know that protocols ossify over time, right? We all use TCP/IP, we all use HTTP. It becomes the norm. When it becomes the norm, there's no need to be toxic about it. There's no one running around on the internet trolling like, oh, TCP/IP or have fun staying poor. Like, it just doesn't matter because the protocol is ossified. So I think that's the direction I see Bitcoin going. It's just going to ossify like an internet protocol, and toxicity will be a chapter in its early development. So I'm with you.
Yeah, hopefully. And, I think people like you who are doing like social media outreach and videos that are like trying to level up, the interested public's understanding of this space and trying to get to the fundamentals. I think that kind of activity plays a crucial role in this. By analogy, it's kind of like I've devoted like arguably about half of my scientific career to scientific outreach and kind of like trying to explain other people's science to the general public, because I think if the science only exists in journal publications in some library, it doesn't like really exist in an actionable, usable way. It only really exists if the ideas get out there to the general public. And I think the view that Bitcoin will triumph no matter what, even with the worst PR and even with organized, opposition from government, legacy finance, mainstream media, and public opinion. I mean, good luck with that. There's never been a political revolution in history that succeeded against that kind of headwind. And if you think that Bitcoin is, among other things, a political revolution, you've got to treat it as such and take the kind of, call it propaganda, call it public relations, call it public outreach, whatever. You got to take that seriously.
Holding Bitcoin, then, I've always considered it kind of a vote, like you're voting against political authority, effectively, or you're voting for the core principles of free market capitalism in the purest sense. It's like, this is property that you own, that you can trade freely with others and no one can stop you. It's, after this conversation, it seems to me that it's also a virtue signal in a way. Like, if you're holding Bitcoin, talking about Bitcoin, I mean, an authentic one, I guess. I mean, I guess it could also be inauthentic. Is that accurate?
I think functionally, in many subcultures around the world, interest in crypto is it's an intelligence indicator. Like, it's a signal. I'm smart. I understand something that's incredibly counterintuitive and that gets quite technical, and that involves a lot of thinking about kind of the game theory of social interaction and honesty and governance and all that. So it's an intelligence signal. I think it's a signal of kind of hope and optimism that the world can be better, and that I'm not just some doomer-pilled nihilist who's like, everything's shit and it'll get even worse. It can be like, for the Bitcoin maximalists, it can be a little bit of a signal of kind of assertiveness or disagreeableness or orneriness. And I hope that, to maximize its public appeal, that like signaling those traits maybe softens a little bit. But I think it's also a virtue signal in the sense that it does convey a certain set of political values around sort of free markets, but all, anti-government, but more generally, just the idea that money and value should belong to the people, and should be permissionless, and should not depend on some central monopoly through use of force that says, like, you're allowed to have those forms of value and you're not allowed to have those other forms of value.
Yes, I agree. That's maybe, to sharpen it a bit, that's the point I'd like to help spread the signal about, is that it's a vote against coercion in general, right? Like, we don't need coercion anymore. We've used it a lot to organize ourselves forever, basically, but we're growing past it potentially.
And human societies have effectively grown past coercion in so many ways.
Yes.
Like, the Steven Pinker books, like Enlightenment Now, document the many ways in which, like, overall rates of violence and theft and expropriation have, been radically reduced in the last 500 years. And that's awesome. Like most developed countries, you can walk around the streets without worrying that you will be, robbed. And that's a huge kind of progress. And I think we should simultaneously be grateful for that history of kind of gradual liberation from force and fear. And, celebrate that, but also say we still have quite a ways to go, particularly in terms of, let's say, monetary policy.
Agreed. Well, Jeff, thanks so much for coming on. Maybe you just let the audience know. Let's let people know where they can find you.
I've got a website, primalpoly.com, and I've got 4 books out. The Mating Mind, that's about human evolution. Spent, which is about consumer behavior and marketing. One called Mate that I wrote with Tucker Max, which is dating advice to young single men, based on sexual selection theory. and most recently Virtue Signaling, which came out in 2019. Short little book. They're all on Amazon. And I really appreciate the opportunity for a total naive crypto newbie like me to be on your podcast. It's
Well, I
been a real
appreciate
pleasure.
you letting a biology newbie like me talk to you. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Robert. Have a good day.